welcome to the session, Cybernetics between Utopia and Loss of Control, Transparency and Control through Source Code. That is the question, if we can manage transparency and accountability and control of algorithms. And yeah, through source code and different approaches. I'm very happy that you're here and that you found your way to our session. I'm from Praemandatum. We are concerned about literacy, about socio-technical structures, I would say, as sociologists. We are concerned that people understand the technology, and on the other side, we also build technology into privacy into technology, and also there it needs interaction with developers and so on. And that's why we're also involved in a couple of research projects, for instance, EPATS, which is founded by the Ministry for Research and Education, and there we get later in the discussion on the technical solutions we follow there. For now, I want to start with a short story. Once upon a time, there were big machines. They filled rooms, and they were called computers. And they were running with code. And from time to time, people had to fix it and to fix the code and they could add functions and so on. But then there was a changing of the mindset in a way, and people realized that they could split the software from the hardware and sell it as a separate product. And they had the idea that they have to close it down, that no one could copy it, because knowledge is easy to copy, as you know. So back then, it was quite common to put your hands on the code, because otherwise you couldn't interact with the computer. But now we have some years, some decades in between, and today our very personal devices are running computers. This was not foreseen back then. They thought 5 computers would be enough for everything. But now our very personal, very intimate details about ourselves are stored on computers and processed by software. And even if we don't use a device, we subject through algorithms which take decisions about our life, about our information, about prisoners getting free or not, and many different cases. So what can we learn from free software, maybe, from open source software? What do we have for different approaches to get transparency? Because we need to understand what's happening, how are decisions made, what are the norms and the moral which is into the technology and influencing our interaction, our behavior. So let me shortly introduce the panelists. Thank you for moderating this panel. Ben Wagner, he's assistant professor at Vienna University. He will moderate. Then we have Francien Dechesne from the E-Law Center for Law and Digital Technologies in Leiden. And she will talk a bit about the other actors, or about the actor relationships which lead to the norms into technology. Correct me later if you make different points. Polina Malaja is policy analyst from the Free Software Foundation Europe. She will introduce into the free software benefits or possibilities we get through this approach to transparency and accountability. Mirco, Pietsch, my colleague, at Praemandatum, will talk about ways to bring literacy to users, mainly. And Sandra Wachter will talk about different ways to yeah, to get to know how algorithms work, maybe. Maybe I'm allowed to cut it down like that. So then, now let's getting started.
Thank you very much. And to just say briefly that this, as we're going to have an interactive panel as possible, so this is also very focused on the audience. We want you to be involved as well as much as possible. I have the mic in front of me. I'm not sure if it's doing anything. That's not good.
Yeah.
Would you like me to eat it as well? Okay, I'm now eating the microphone. It doesn't taste very good, but what I'm trying to say is this is meant to be a very interactive panel. So once the people have presented, if you have any immediate questions of understanding, please wave both of your arms very high up in front of you, and then we can answer those briefly. But also, we want to have a very extensive discussion afterwards that very directly involves the audience. This is not just about us telling you what the world is, but you telling us and interacting with us and us developing ideas and concepts together. So please both come forward if you're coming in right now. Don't hide and sit at the back. Come as far forward as you feel comfortable. But also, do feel that you're part of this debate. We're not here to tell you what the truth is. We want to discuss it with you as well and find out where we're going with this. So with that, Francien, the floor is yours.
I think I like to eat my, have my lollipop and eat it too. No, oh, there we go. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm very interested in the question that the panel lays on the table, which to me is, can open source open the black box that we have when it comes to algorithmic decisions? I work at the Center for Law and Digital Technologies, which is located in the law school of the Leiden University, but for me that is not the most obvious place to work, as I was trained as a computer scientist. But working in a law department has taught me about different types of code that co-constitute the way decisions are made in our society. I have, to me, the topic of this panel confronted me with a number of dilemmas. So, can open source open the black box? On the one hand, I would say yes, because I think code is a great code in the sense of computer code is maybe the most transparent part of the whole algorithmic decision process. I'm trying to, oh, sorry. Yes. Code is maybe the most transparent part of algorithmic decision processes, but it's never the whole decision process by itself. The code is embedded in social structures. The code is, well, maybe most importantly, it totally depends on data that go in the form of the data, the selection of those data. So in that sense, also in a technical view, from a technical viewpoint, code is really just a tiny and maybe not the most meaningful part of an algorithmic decision. But as I said, the good thing about code is that it might be the most objective and the most transparent part of the algorithmic network, the entire network that is involved in making algorithmic decisions. And so I do see an important role for open source in our call for transparency and accountability, but it poses a few dilemmas. For example, what's often brought up is if we expose code, what does it tell us? Well, I think that not everybody in the world that is affected by algorithmic decisions has to be able to understand every letter, every command of the code, because I think that through a chain of translations where computer scientists are involved, people who bridge over to other disciplines like ethics and political science can make the translations so that the people who are affected may not read the code themselves, but will understand how they are affected by this. I do think a very good, a very important aspect of openness is that it allows for scrutiny. I have to say, however, that given that these algorithmic decisions are really networks and code just being a tiny part of it, we should be careful not to put all our focus on the one part that's most transparent to us or to a part of our society, and then lay all the blame on the part that we can see, because, well, if you realize we've been dealing with intransparency in human decisions for ages, and we've been able to deal with that too. I think I would like to leave it at these points.
Thank you very much. I think that was an excellent and perfectly on time introduction. Very much appreciated. And Mirco or Polina, would you like to go first? And Mirco, maybe.
It's not me.
No, it's all good. Don't worry. You're last.
Okay, I guess I'll just continue. Hi, I'm Mirco. I also work at Praemandatum, and I was hoping for a bit more technical or regulatory input before I could point out what I'm going to talk about, which is, as you already stated, Daniel, is media literacy. I'm an educator, I'm a teacher, as you, so to speak, and yeah, what I would like to do is to change the perspective a bit, and we were talking about decision making via algorithms and by code, by machines, by technology. And I would like to focus on the decision making we do as individuals and as a person. And I think that's one of the aspects that we try to include in our seminars and our workshops when we talk to students, high school or even adults. And we try to explain how decision making actually works and what it has to do with a stable personality. So to frame that, privacy within your personality development is highly affiliated with making experiences and to be able to reflect upon these experiences in order to make one step further in your developmental, in your development as a person. And a big part of that is to decide who to involve in this decision making, or in this in the talk about what does this mean, this experience mean for myself. And I would argue that in terms of algorithmic decision making, the choice of involvement is not non-existent anymore. So what that means is that we are not the person who makes the decision, but we can only decide upon all the things we get provided, the information we get provided. That's a big part of media literacy, to be able to look at the information and to evaluate and to accumulate this into my own worldview or whatever you want. That's one big aspect to actually see how decision making works for the individual, for the person. And you were talking about the privacy enhancing technologies. What we're trying to do is, in one of our research projects, is to give the user a better understanding of what happens within app permissions. If you install an app, the app makes a lot of requests, AP calls to use the microphone, the camera, or whatever. And in that point, to give an understanding dialogue, to help the understanding of what data actually flows in the background. And that's one aspect that we could go into more detail maybe. But for the moment, that's, I think, gives a fair overview. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you very much. And just so you see very different perspectives on the same question, because we're really trying to take a 360-degree view on ways in which code can be understood, and also how responses can be from both a very software-focused or a library, and then from an educational perspective. And now we have Polina, who again comes from a very different perspective and will give us a slightly different overview of how we can think about this question. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, works good. All right, so I actually would like to kind of tie it a little bit to both point of views, and I agree with both. So I have to say that software is defining quality of life in the ways that we have never imagined before, and it's more and more widespread. Computers are faster, they process a much bigger amount of information that a human brain can now be able to handle in the same way. They also do not need a break or a lunch break or go to sleep. So it also sometimes means that if we sort of get the human out of the equation, then the automatic decision-making process would probably then be maybe fairer, because computers have to base their decision-making on the cold facts, the statistics, without seeing the person in front of them. So just a few examples where automatic decision-making is already taking place and sort of replacing the human labor is, for example, software allocates recently graduated pupils into the universities. Software also decides whether an applicant is creditworthy, during the bank application processes. Software selects appropriate applicants for a job interview for a human to interview. Also, software sends police patrols to the neighborhoods that are most likely to cause trouble. And finally, software also decides on the length of the sentence of an offender. And this is already actually happening, and not from a point of science fiction point of view. However, it is misleading to assume that if software is deciding on those aspects, that the faulty human is somehow absolutely eliminated from this process. In fact, it's not. Computers learn what human feeds to them, and in this sense, if the facts or the criteria or the algorithm, the variables that algorithms are basing their decision making is based on a small a quantity of information feed by them by a handful of humans, then the mistakes that these algorithms do are much bigger on scale, and also in speed. So the consequences of this decision making is actually much more grave or bigger. So any decision making that concerns our fundamental rights and freedoms and functioning society needs to be transparent and accountable. And in the case of software, it also needs to be verifiable. So from governments to judicial systems to university applications, these institutions are responsible for ensuring our human rights, and the decision making, either it's done by a human or an algorithm, needs to be also open to the public and for public scrutiny. So access to code is just one part of the whole framework, and also only halfway for desired transparency and accountability. So free software is defined through 4 freedoms it gives to users. So it's not only access to code, it's also the freedoms to use the software the way they want, to share it with others, to study how it works, and to improve it in case it's buggy or it just needs to be adapted. So the 4 freedoms guarantee not only the access to the source code, to the algorithm, but also actually the full access to the logic behind it, because you can just build the software on your own and test it. So, however, the pure access to algorithms does not guarantee that the ultimate decision making is actually fair. And so also the other criteria needs to be open for public. And the algorithm and the decision making also needs to be evaluated in the socio-informatic context, to actually be aware of the biases that people feed to the algorithm. And also sort of the algorithm itself is not an answer to eliminating discrimination or anything like that. It's just a way to actually improve it and assess and make it a much more knowledgeable. It needs to be more knowledgeable. I'm sorry, I'm a little nervous. Yes. Okay. So I just want to say that just to conclude. Access to source code and free software licenses that ensure the access to source code that free software licenses ensure is a very necessary prerequisite to the transparency, but it's not the only way or the only thing that needs to be assessed when it comes to automated decision making. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Just from the statements you've heard before, are there any immediate questions of understanding? That anything was not unclear? I think the speakers were extremely clear, but just in case, perfect. Then, our last speaker, Sandra Wachter, the floor is yours.
Great. No, that's not the right slide deck. I'm sorry. Okay, now we have it. Great. Hi, I'm Sandra Wachter. I'm a lawyer and research fellow at the Oxford University at the Oxford Internet Institute, and I'm also a research fellow at the Turing Institute in London. And I want to talk about AI accountability using counterfactual explanation, a method that we describe in a paper that we just published that aims to make algorithms more explainable. So the paper I wrote together with Dr. Brent Middlestad and Dr. Christopher Russell, where we try to find a way of giving explanations to individuals that are actually meaningful and assess this within the legal framework. So what do I mean by counterfactuals? So counterfactuals means describe the dependency of external facts on a decision, and you can give an individual multiple explanations so they understand what's actually happening in the decision-making process. You can give them multiple counterfactuals to understand that. The good thing about counterfactuals is that there is no need to understand the internal logic of an algorithm, and those counterfactuals can be generated even in highly complex systems like neural nets, for example. And because you only give limited information to the data subject, it's also less likely to infringe on trade secrets and privacy of others. Just to give you a graph, how that would look like. So this is the system, the red dot over here, that's you not getting the loan, not getting hired, you being sent to prison, and you want to know why. And so basically what we're doing is expanding this to get to the blue line until we touch it and generate a counterfactual, right? So it tells you the minimal changes that need to happen in order to get where you want to be. So to get the job, to get the loan, not to be sent to prison. So that's the idea of a counterfactual, what we are doing. And why are we doing this? So a counterfactual could be a statement, something like this. So you have been denied a loan because your income was £40,000. If it had been £45,000, you have been offered the loan. So that's a counterfactual explanation. Yeah. So why is that good? First of all, it helps you to understand the decision. You know that income played a role in the decision-making process, which is good. It also could help you challenge decisions, because you could go back and say, well, actually, I'm making 45,000 K, so I should be offered the loan. And you could also use it to alter future decisions. It might just be that your income is actually too low, but at least you know that the income is an important component in the decision-making process. So if you know that for the future, you can actually adapt your behavior. So this is a different approach that we have taken in that paper, because there was too much focus on general cause of transparency and accountability, but nobody was really asking the question, why do we actually need that? So we took a different approach, and I'm happy to discuss this further. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you very much. So I just have a few brief questions from my side, and then I think we'll open it up. Maybe to go straight away to our first presentation, I was very interested when we were hearing from Francien that code is the most transparent part, and that it's the most transparent element in the entire process. And I always find this argument a little bit difficult, because I agree with you that in theory code could be the most transparent part, but in almost all of the implementations we see in the real world, code is the least transparent part. It's the part that's locked away, it's the part that's difficult to scrutinize because it's either proprietary or it's difficult to get hold of, or you don't actually have access to the code. So while I totally understand the argument, do you feel that there are a large amount of empirical cases where the code is really that easy to scrutinize? Where it's really possible to make statements about this on an empirical basis? Because right now I find that very difficult.
I must admit that I was making the statement from the premise of the panel to look at open source, and I was not talking from the reality that you very justifiably described, that the code is often not made available. But I would say that so it was more a normative statement than a descriptive statement, that you should make the code available in order to satisfy requirements of scrutinizability. But I am aware that oftentimes this, especially with proprietary software, we are very far from that. But it's sort of making a case for we should go more in the direction of the open software movement. And also, when I say code is the most transparent part, I mean code isolated as, let's say, the algorithm, but I hope I also expressed that, but I immediately realized that even if we have the code available, there's this whole network and this whole process around it that is a lot harder to make transparent, but that's very constitutive of the outcomes. So that's another hurdle. Even if we have the source code open, then there's still the fact that this network of algorithmic decisions is so complex that it might give us something, but it will never be the entire solution.
Perfect. I think that's really helpful, because it also sort of specifies it a bit as a normative claim to this is where we need to be and this is where we could be. But in the empirical cases, we often see that this is where we're not, and so it would be better if we got there. It also leads to a question for Polina as well, because I think it leads directly from that. It was very interesting when you were talking about the different examples of software that is used. You also mentioned, I think you used the words faulty humans, who then also make mistakes. And I find that in a lot of these debates, it's often it's necessary to show that humans are faulty or bad or make mistakes to then make computers seem somehow better. Because then it's easier to say, well, we need computers to replace something that is already bad. But I'm not quite sure that's what you're trying to say. So what's the relationship there between the faulty human and the software that is coming in? Are they both faulty? Is one faulty? How do you conceive of the sort of the human being in that context?
Yeah, sure. So, the claim that I was making, I think it was just sort of, from a user perspective, I think it always seems like, okay, computers are just so smart and this is where we are, and I don't have to think about the context. But the fact is that software is built by humans, and there's no such thing as a perfect software without any bugs. So this is where we need the transparency and the auditability of the software, and this is where free software license is, in fact, an answer to this, because it gives you the full access to the code. Because the thing is that there are also some cases, for example, the one I mentioned with the software that is allocating students across universities. It's the actual case from France, where a student rights organization actually requested the source code of the software, and in order to be able to just see how it works and how the algorithm is actually allocating students. And it's an interesting case because obviously the software was not made public under a free software license, so the authorities went for just basically printing out the source code on paper and sending it by post. And what they received, the students received from there, was really it's like it was complete nonsense. They couldn't do anything with it. They actually had to just publish it on GitHub in order for to ask the community to look into the software and see what it is. So this is really, there are a lot of sort of cases where when there is no clear requirement to publish software under a particular license that will ensure all those rights to look into the software, then we might end up in those funny cases when sort of authorities are trying to sort of circumvent that requirement by giving you just a list of papers with code, but you cannot actually use it. So
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think Francien, you wanted to jump in as well.
Yes, on a positive note, I wanted to mention that recently at the Center for Law and Digital Technologies, we had a guest lecture by Melanie Reback, who funded a business called Radically Open Security. And when we speak of security, I think that's an example of where people are extremely secretive about revealing any information. But her business is actually founded on the premise that we can do a better job if we be as open as possible about repairing security holes in companies. And she funded a company on that premise, and she's competing against the big closed consultancies, and she's very successful. So I would like to mention that as an example where openness, even in an area of application that is extremely secretive, is a good way forward, because she gets great demands from companies. I mean, they really see the attraction in working with her and her company. So that's a practical example of where it can work.
Perfect, thanks. I think that's a great example, but it also feeds directly into a question for Sandra, because there's a lot of debate at the moment about this whole question about explanations and the ability for us to explain what is happening in the context of algorithms. And so it would be interesting, do you think that free software can solve this problem, or is there a different solution? And do you have a better understanding of what makes this question so controversial in the first place? Why is it such a big deal?
So the question of explainability has been debated in the legal community, in the machine learning community. And it's controversial in that sense that if a system is very, very complex and nobody understands, not even the people who are actually designing those systems understand how those systems work. Even if they do, and you give that information to an individual, that's not really useful. So I've worked with Christopher Russell on that paper. He's the machine learning person, and Brent Middlestad is the ethicist, so it was a really multidisciplinary approach. And the paper is publicly available if you want to have a look. And we started talking about this, and I was very much defending the idea that we should have explanations, and I still believe that. But then he showed me what an explanation actually looks like. I was like, that's useless. That is completely useless. That's not the thing that I actually want. So I get the argument here, but there's still some need from accountability. So even if you can make those systems explainable, it's probably not going to be very useful for an individual. And the other thing that's not really so much a tech problem, it's more like a legal problem, that there is a lot of resistance from companies to disclose how the algorithm works because of trade secret and intellectual property rights. And also, if you disclose too much about the algorithm, you might able to re-identify other people in the data set, right? So these are the things that basically forming the discussion right now. But I understand all those arguments, but we might need to think outside the box to find ways of explaining that system.
Quite literally outside the black box. Yeah. Perfect. But then just to broaden things up a little bit, because we're talking very much now about sort of software and code and open source and different ways of doing it. And I think it would also be interesting to have a perspective from sort of a broader educator's perspective. So when you're teaching in schools and when you're in a situation that you're regularly debating with students, is it useful for them also to have access to the code of the systems they're talking about so that they understand and know what's going on? Is that part of what you're able to discuss? And also related to that, do they have an understanding of what free software is or what it means to them? So do they have a context where they can say, okay, this is useful, or if I were to do that, I'd try and do it like this? Or is it a completely blank slate and they just want to create the next closed source startup to make lots of money.
Yeah, that's pretty much describing how what we are actually seeing if we are in schools or even with adults. You don't get that far. You cannot talk about what code actually does. You can briefly touch upon the issue. What is an algorithm? What is a sequence? What is actually been done? But you have to adapt the actual everyday life from the students, and that's not looking at code, but it's the front end and the how is it giving me information about my peer group, and how is it what's up in my town or whatever. It's not the providing of the information that you can talk about, but the effect on what is the information and how does it affect my daily life. So you don't get that far that you can include any aspects of decision making via algorithm in that short period of time that we usually have.
But then when the students are, for example, looking at, let's say, everyday website, do they notice when this everyday large platform that we're not going to name says like you saw this ad because, or when they notice that the algorithm behind how their timeline is selected changed and now it's more personalized, do they notice that, and do they feel they want to have control over that or understand that better?
Yeah, definitely. The one aspect that you can elaborate on, and which is usually a good way to introduce a topic, is advertisement, and that's when we can briefly talk about is that something that frightens you, or is that something that you might want to change. That's definitely the case, but still you don't get to that point where they can make an informed decision, because the entire peer group and everybody around them is involved in that or is included in that bubble that they have to be able to reach and contact each other, and they usually don't tend to take into account to use open software.
Thanks. I think that's an extremely valuable point from sort of a very high-level discussion about open source and free software and code, to also remember that the everyday user has slightly different needs and desires. But there are so many more people in this room who are much smarter than I am. The only thing that you need to know is that because we don't have roving mics for you, I will have to repeat the question just so it's on camera as well, but I can also give you the mic, I think that's okay, if you want, depending, or I can repeat the question, whatever easier. Please, the floor is all of yours.
Thank you. I'm Claudio Agosti. I'm not exactly a question, but rather an inflammatory opinion. That open source has lost the fight against artificial intelligence in 2016, when two huge companies released their own DeepMind and deep learning technology. In this way, Facebook and Google, namely, made a technology accessible to everybody, that this developer can create open source software that use those technology, but to take decision that depend on the training set. So an amount of data that train a machine. And this implied the separation between code and training model. This is also spreading the narrative on we cannot explain how it works, because it's the training set that imply the final decision. So the code can be also free software, open source, you can modify it, but without a proper training set, or without understanding in the middle of the neural network, and nobody can, we cannot know why this algorithm give these answers. And somehow that has changed the narrative on the fact that code is not anymore the only protagonist for the outcome.
That was slightly depressing. Would anybody on the panel like to respond?
So I do agree, unfortunately, with your analysis. And it also points to a question that I wanted to ask to Sandra, actually. Because of the, you could say, the context dependence of the outcome of an algorithm, the premise of your counterfactual explanations, I think you used the word you can go back to a certain decision and then see what needed to happen to get another outcome. But can we be certain that not something changed in the neural network from the moment when the initial decision was taken and the moment that we question, well, what would have happened if I would have had a different shoe size, for example? It could really be with these neural networks that the system has evolved in the meantime, and we will never know whether the outcome would have been more favorable if I had a different shoe size, for example.
I just want to say what you said, because I agree with you, and I actually was missing that in the discussion as well, and nobody's talking about the data, which is actually the more interesting thing. So I totally agree with you. Thanks for raising that. With regard to your question, yes. So it depends on the model. If it's you have different kinds of models. If you have slow-changing models, then you could do it. If it's fast-changing models, then you could have a problem. What you can do is you can artificially freeze the model if you want to. And if you have a relationship with your, I don't know, with your bank or something, and they tell you what needs to change, you could have like an agreement if you make that change within a certain time that you don't actually get the loan, right? So this is a question of implementation. The other question that you raised is the importance of the variables. So we use a distance function that makes counterfactual sparse. That means it only gives you the important ones that the decision relied upon. Right? There may be other things that were factored into the decision, but they were not important for that. So even if you change that, that wouldn't make a difference. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. We have a question over here.
René Maillot, Delft University of Technology. I have one question to Sandra and one more broader remark. And I start with the remark. I think the openness and the use of open software could have a much bigger impact if the financing structure behind it would be more solved. And one thing that I would like everyone to just bring out in the world, there is this story of Barcelona, the city that decided that from now on all public software needs to be open. If more cities or more whatever public bodies would start to do that, then a huge amount of money would flow into the development of open software, and only then can we start to really compare what it can do. So that's for the remark. And then for the question to Sandra, I really love your work. I think it's amazing. There's one thing, open question, I think, or probably many, but one that I want to ask you, which is, yes, you can have your counterfactual, but let's assume the following. You put in a different address in your bank loan application, and you find out that if I would have been in another address, I would have gotten the loan, or would have not gotten the loan. But then you still don't know why is it that if I were on another address, I would or would not have gotten. And what are your thoughts about that?
Before we throw the mic back again, should we maybe take one more question to ask the question here in the back, and then we'll respond to one of them, I promise. Thank you.
Hey. Thanks so much for the discussion. I have a question also to Sandra, but anyone feel free to address it if it falls into your competence. Let's imagine we're talking about an open source issue and whether the counterfactual work that you're doing applies. So let's say you are working, there's an algorithm that is meant to do data minimization. Let's say Francien is of a citizenship, and that data needs to be taken, the personal data collected from Francien needs to be taken out of a data pool, and there's an algorithm that is meant to do that. Would the counterfactual work that you're doing, or does anybody know of another type of tool that could be used to verify independently the data minimization that takes place? So I've heard, just to throw it in, of a thing like a sock puppet audits, so that if I put Francien's email from an Italian provider in, maybe this could lead to another red bell that would ring and say, hey, the auditing, the algorithm doesn't work. Do you know of any other tool, or does your counterfactual apply to that? Thank you so much.
Somebody from the audience is asking for free software development. Sandra, the floor is yours. Would you like to help him?
Yeah, I agree with you. We didn't solve the problem completely. I'm not claiming that. So, and I completely agree the why question is unanswered even with the counterfactuals, and that is still a problem. So like the causality and why something is happening in the system, we cannot do that with that. And I agree, and I think we still need to pursue interpretability. It's very, very important. It was just something that could help us to get through until we solved it. But to touch on what you said, I think it's, yes, and I think there's urgency that we decide as a society what we're going to do with those systems. If we're actually not able to understand what they're doing, why and where do we want to deploy them? But that's probably more a democratic question rather than a legal or a technical one. But yeah, I agree with you. The other thing about data minimization. So I've been working with machine learning people, and yeah, writing that paper was interesting. There was a lot of screaming involved because we needed to get our mindset straight, because I'm a data protection lawyer. That means, you know, data minimization, storage limitation, no sensitive data, all of that. And machine learning person is like, yeah, are you crazy? That's not going to work, right? So having that vocabulary straight and understanding that data minimization is something that is completely contradictory to what data protection law actually wants, right? So if you look, for example, at the GDPR, it says you're only allowed to collect data for specific purposes, only you know, store it for a limited amount of time, only collect data that's absolutely necessary, which is a problem. And what you said is, well, what if I request access to that data and say, please rectify that data or delete the data? What's going to happen with that now, right? These are fundamental rights that are in GDPR. And if you talk to machine learning people like that, that's insane. We cannot do that. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. Maybe we need to educate ourselves to find a better way how to deal with that, because I get the argument, you know, especially when it comes to discrimination. If you talk to machine learning people, it's like you need as much data as possible to make sure they don't discriminate against people. And data protection lawyers are like, no. So there is tension at the moment that is unresolved, but I think we're trying to work on this together. And since more and more people are actually working interdisciplinary, I hope we're going to have a better understanding or a better ideal concept soon.
And thanks also for the revelation. I'm sure it's not new to anybody in this room, but still that also multi or inter or transdisciplinary work always involves screaming, otherwise you're not doing a good job. No, it involves tension and friction and difficulty, and to pretend otherwise would be to lie to the people who fund these sorts of things. It's hard.
Yeah, and we had a philosopher on board as well. So there was so much screaming. There was a lot of screaming.
It sounds like as long as it's productive screaming, that's good. But there was one other point which I think is very relevant for the rest of the panel, which was touched in a little bit in what you called the business model of open source. But maybe to shift it a little bit into what the terms that Sandra was just using now is also a democratic question, or like a question of democratic organization of societies. There seems to be two questions. The one is like the funding of publicly funded software, which could potentially only be required to be open source, like in Barcelona. The other thing is requiring systems used by the public sector to be explainable and accessible, and thereby also likely open source. And there's a very big difference in that. The one is where you develop a computer program, the other one is perhaps a service. And so it's for the other panelists as well. Do you think that this can really change the way we think about algorithms and automation? Is there a space there that if we're willing as societies to take that step and say this needs to happen, that then we will also see a benefit in understanding the systems around us?
Yeah, so we'll just do a little bit of promotional work as well, and thanks for raising the Barcelona town example. Yeah, so as FSFE, we are currently campaigning for Public Money, Public Code, which is a campaign which is directly targeted at public administrations with the demand to publish all publicly funded software, newly developed publicly funded software as free software. And the point we're making that obviously it will have many benefits for society in general, but also for security reasons, because less possibilities for backdoors, just because the code is available and public, and as many people as knowledgeable people can look into this. And so we have a website that Ben is currently looking up. It's publiccode.eu, and please everybody just go there and sign the open letter. And Barcelona town has also joined us. Publiccode.eu, yes. So just like that. You can also just search for public money, public code, it will appear. And yes, and this is exactly what we're making. They're making the claim that while we're focusing obviously on software, we see the benefits of this particular approach also for opening up the processes. And there is also a very nice example from Ukraine where actually the procurement system and when we know Ukraine has some problem with corruption and in general, like some of this like fundamental, let's say, problems in the sector. And their procurement system has been developed as free software, but also together with civil society and academia, and also respecting the open data principles and values. So I think this is where we can all just work together. Code is just one part of the let's say of this the whole framework, but we also need to look up on the other open access and open data movements in order to just to make sure that the public infrastructure that we rely on and that our lives rely on are not in hands just of a handful of service providers. Yeah.
Perfect, thank you very much. Mirco, do you want to add something to that?
Well, if you're talking about open software in Verwaltung, public administration, exactly. Thank you. As a German, it comes to mind the example in Munich where they tried to use open software in the administration, but they failed because the usability wasn't as convenient as the people working there were used to. So that's one part, and where I see a big gap is to try to give aid on how to use this software. Obviously, you don't get as it nice and shiny and blinky and point and clicky as you get it with an iOS device. But there are way more benefits in using these software, and this is an understanding that has not yet fully been given to the people. And one more aspect that it's that I see in my hometown in Hanover, where they started to using proprietary software in schools and giving away the hardware that comes with it. And that's one thing where you cannot. The privacy aspect was a big part of the discussion. But now they're using proprietary software, so that's one aspect that's from my side, in the educational part, it's really tricky to get even a working understanding of which software does and which software might be the better choice. So I'm not quite sure about that.
Thanks, I think that's really helpful. Francien, would you like to add anything in there?
A thought that came up somewhat earlier in the discussion, and my mind is still computing whether it connects directly to the current topic on the table. But Mirco, you speak about education, and Sandra, you also said that we are thinking about educating legislators or other people to understand code better. But one of the things that I try to do is also to educate coders to understand the context in which their code is used better. In computer ethics classes, but what now just came up is the importance of having good user interfaces. And I think, so this translational work that you also mentioned, that goes with some screening maybe also, but with some screaming when teaching computer ethics to students who in fact they chose to look at code all day. I mean, you, Mirco, you were talking about students who are not confronted with code. It's not their daily work, but there are students who actually choose to only write and read code. And I'm trying to educate them on social impact a little bit more. And I think that this type of examples, educating them on democratic principles and how open source code can play a role in keeping our democracy transparent, also in the way computers, information technology is used within it, is another part of education that needs to happen and that we try to do.
Sounds great. Are there any more questions from the floor? I have plenty more, but I just want to make sure. Please, Claudio, do you want to?
I have a theory, like out of the box, that we should not advocate for a better AI, but instead of having a smart tool, having dumb tool in the hand of smart person. And that can permit to create tools that are composed by a set of simple functions, completely auditable. For me, the definition of a smart tool or dumb tool is that if a tool keeps a state, so a state in the execution, something that can be trained or something that can be learned and reused, if it's keeping a state, is smart. Instead, without the state, you can do always a more strict audit. You can have an open source component or free software component and closed source component and still see what enters and what goes out. That kind of framing can still solve many of our problems. We don't need to reverse engineering the spread of the cancer all the day. No? That is something for which deep learning can help, but are specific application.
Would anybody like to respond to that? I'm not sure it was a question, but please, Francien.
Well, this reminds me of an initiative that I value very much. That's, for me, an example of how also coders become aware of their role in society, and that is when Phil Roggaway held a lecture for his fellow cryptographers, and from the stance of we have to consider the moral impact of our work, and maybe instead of discussing on these cryptographic conferences how we can be smarter and make even smarter cryptography, we should think about dumber systems that scale better, because we can impact the world a lot better with that. And so I do feel that there's resonation for maybe we should stop with the smartness and make better things. Yes. Smart is not always better. Smarter is not always better. Yes. Dumber might be better than smarter. Yes.
Dumber might be better. That's a beautiful hashtag. I think we're going to have great fun with that. Are there any more questions in the room? Because if I don't see anybody, I have one challenge for my panelists, which is last night, and I'm sure that many people in the room have seen it as well, a guy called Vijay Pandey, I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly, from Andreessen Horowitz, a venture capital firm that invests in biology and computer science, including AI, published a quite controversial op-ed in the New York Times saying that the black box is nothing to fear and we shouldn't worry about artificial intelligence because, as we've in part already heard, we shouldn't be concerned because the code is actually far better than the human being, right? So it's far easier to understand. And so if humans are already faulty and can't explain anything, then surely the world will be a better place if we just trust it to these black boxes, because even if they can explain a bit, that's still more than the stupid, dumb humans. At least that's how I understood the article, but perhaps it's a misinterpretation. But I would be very interested how my panelists think about that argument or that line of thought and how they feel about it, because if the black box isn't the problem, then we don't need this panel and we can go back to doing other things and dancing and drinking and whatever. What do you think, Francien?
Well, with these statements, I always have a big problem in who gets to determine what is better, connecting to our previous statements, but there are people making statements that more computations is better. And then I think, but better in what respect? Better according to whom? And better for whom? And we are thinking about applying these systems within society for us, for humans, or for the world, and just making more computations. Well, maybe dumber is better sometimes.
Hashtag dumber is better, please. Polina, would you like to respond?
Yes, I completely agree with Francien, and in general, I think this is also the point I was trying to make during my intervention as well a little bit, that it's a complete misunderstanding, and it's not. Yes, computers are faster and process much more information, but humans are the ones that feed that information to computers. That means that computer will just make the same mistake on a much bigger scale, instead of one faulty human. So that's that's my answer to this.
Perfect. Sandra?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think algorithms help us maybe to make more consistent decisions. That means it could mean a bad decision is consistently spread among other people, all people. That's fair, right? But it's not better, I think, at least. And I agree with the bias problem. Of course, they're going to replicate the biases that are in the data set, and the biases are there because we are biased. So you could say, well, we have been living in this awful world, so why not continue to do so, right? I guess that's not like at least I think that's not the role of technology. It should actually be more aspiring than that. And the other thing is it's different than humans because, it can reinforce new stereotypes and new biases that we didn't have in the first place because, it just works differently. So all of a sudden you start not only discriminating against people that have protected attributes like gender, ethnicity, or something like that, so you start making new discrimination. So it could actually make things worse. So I would rather focus on using those systems to make decisions better rather than saying, well, we have been awful in the past, so that's fine.
And so, just so you beautifully, eloquently put it, I've tried to introduce this hashtag before, but it never quite worked. Not just that dumb is better, we already know this, but that algorithms provide a particular brilliant opportunity to fail at scale rather than just in an individual context. And
I like that too.
We fail at scale rather than just in an individual context. It's beautiful power, but we have a question right at the back. Please? No question. Okay, so the questions have all been addressed. That's fantastic. So just this idea that you can fail at scale in this context then changes the conversation from the human or the individual being better and comes down to more of a question of who benefits from whom being better, and then becomes far much more a question of power. And I'd just be interested again from the context of this sort of the learning environment that you work in. Does this translate? Are students aware that they're in a sort of a power inequality relationship where they have some difficulties getting access to things? Or is that just something that they take for granted because it's part of their everyday lives and they have no choice?
Yeah, that's interesting because I was on a conference 2 weeks ago, and the question was, it was an adult education conference, and they were talking about what can I teach the young ones who are driving up the career ladder or whatever. The main question was they can Google everything, or they can use a search engine and use everything, but they are not able at that point where they can ask the right questions, and that was the main point, and that's what you can see in schools as well. They can Google everything, or they can find every answer to the questions they were asking, but the main point is how do they come to the question, and that's that one point that, as you were saying, Polina, the machines cannot do on their own, but we can just create our own questions, as a human. So yeah, that's one thing the future generation definitely has to made aware of, that they have to generate their own questions and not rely upon everything they being provided.
Thanks, and I think that's really valuable. I'd like to come back to one specific point, which I think is quite interesting, where, because there was a suggestion before that free software will also allow us to move into this world where algorithmic decisions or other automated systems decisions are more understandable. Is it also possible that we create, through putting free software everywhere, a facade of transparency? That we just like create this sort of Potemkin village where everything is open and free, but the actual control is still somewhere else in proprietary? And following on from that as well, the specific context of openness also brings with it challenges when we're talking about, let's say, embedding specific values within that. Like if you want to, for example, have your software only used by other people who also care about privacy, that's quite difficult in the context of the way the free software licensing regime works right now, because that wouldn't be a free software license as you understand it. And so just to say, how do we embed values, things that we care about, in a way that doesn't create these Potemkin villages, but that actually creates sort of a society or a democratic future that we would hope for? I know that's a very big question, so good luck, but I'm sure that you'll have an amazing answer.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I agree on Potemkin villages. That's the thing. The free software or access to code is not the answer to all our problems in terms of with democracy, but it's one of the necessary prerequisites in order to achieve that. And I mean, it's exactly the same thing. Like we can't just exclude one with another. Like we just have to take it in the context, and we have to see at different levels of decision making in terms of, you know, like, okay, code, yes, we see it, we can verify, we can reuse it, but then we need to also see to other stuff. And again, it's also a little bit like the whole question was, I think it was a very, very nice question, but very broad in terms of, I mean, we also kind of went a little bit into like morals and ethics and this kind of stuff. And this is where just a pure free software license can also, it's not a place to search for an answer. And yeah, so it's a difficult question, but.
Of course. Anybody else on the panel? Please.
I think I want to shift it a bit, because I think the whole question of transparency, like, what stands behind it is the question of accountability. So we want somebody who's accountable. Accountable for what? So because we have some particular danger in mind, some adversary, some whatever, discrimination, for example, right? So I think it's also important to look at that and actually think about the possible harms that could happen from that, rather than saying, oh, we're just going to be open and transparent. I think it's more useful to think about what is it that we actually want to protect. So Brent Middlestead and I, we are working, for example, on a project on ethical auditing mechanisms. So we are actually just test for the thing that you are concerned with in the decision-making process, which is, I think, an additional approach that could help to increase accountability.
Maybe if you just say the question and I'll repeat it, I think that's easy. Thank you. So just for the audience that are watching in a digital context, we were being asked about, without going into too much detail now, the normativity of specific solutions that are being suggested beyond the specific technical context, and whether that's, I guess, if I understand you correctly, inserting values into a system that may not be wanted either by the system designer or by the organization.
They might be good transparency solutions, but are they good legal solutions?
And the question is then, are they good transparency solutions or even good legal solutions as well? Maybe it's just one or the other, and both might be difficult. Please.
Yeah, from a legal perspective, I think it's hard to answer because we don't know yet. So GDPR is going to come into force soon. So how the whole framework will be interpreted and what will be legally mandated in terms of transparency has been debated for 1.5 years now. And there are no consensus. We cannot have consensus because it's not enforced yet. So But there are some indications in the recently published Article 29 Working Party Guidelines who give guidance on the first indication of how the framework should be interpreted in terms of algorithmic transparency. And what you said, the information about the logic in the algorithmic system is more likely to be a very broad description of the algorithm itself. So basically to say, okay, I'm using those methods in order to make responsible and ethical lending decisions, for example. Or I regularly test my methods to make sure that they are not discriminatory or biased. So I think what the law wants there, what the law says and what the guidelines suggest means that it's probably easy to fulfill but ethical and satisfactory, in my opinion. So I actually think from an ethical viewpoint we should be doing more than what the law currently suggests.
Okay, that's a very strong point and actually encouraging. No, it's important to also say that like just legal compliance alone might not get you all the way, and you need to acknowledge that and think about that as companies who are implementing the GDPR right now. Are there further points on that or questions? Because if there are no further questions in the room and from the panelists, I have one last question for you all, which is if there is, let's say, 2 things in the world that you could change right now, and you had the ability to change anything, to genuinely allow for a more transparent way of dealing with automated systems, algorithms, of course, in some way in relation to open source software, what would that do? What would you recommend somebody who wants to make this change possible right now? What would you tell them? What should they be doing? Francien. Yeah, the joy of going fast.
Well, thank you for that. I'm afraid my limited brain capacity is starting to run out after an intense week. And the first thing that came to mind was Babelfish against the screaming, but I'm not sure whether this is realistic. But so coming back to the point of translation and interdisciplinary work, spaces, venues, that allow for this difficult program of understanding the different perspectives and viewpoints better. I think basically a lot of the actors actually mean to do good, but what it means to do good depends partly on their framework, and there's a lot of translation that needs to happen.
Thanks. I think it's a really important point, and just to add that, like, at the moment, in a lot of these spaces, the screaming is able to happen, but it's hard to do it sustainably because we don't really have institutions that allow for sustainable screaming. So, and that's important to acknowledge that there's a space that a lot of the conflict and friction that comes from that is difficult to sustain and productively keep it going in a long time, because we don't really have those spaces, we just pretend to have them. And so it's fighting for those spaces and keeping those debates alive in spite of the conflict and struggles on the way. I think that's a really important point.
Yeah,
Please.
I basically can just follow up on what you said, because that's my answer as well. I think it's very important to have more communications between different disciplines, so you can have something that designs systems that are legally, required, but also ethically desired and technically feasible. So it has to tick like all 3 of the boxes, because you can think about, from an ethical perspective, whatever you want, but you don't have the legal backing up to actually enforce it, and you have probably a mechanism to enforce it, but it's not technically feasible. So you have to actually have a trilogue in that space, at least, probably more. I'm just saying 3 now, but probably more people to actually work on those things together. And I agree with you at the moment in terms of education. That's not really happening. So I studied law in Austria for some time, and there was no really good communication when it comes to IT law. Like, there was a fringe interest, which is insane. And if you talk to tech people hate lawyers. I kind of understand why, but I do understand why. I think working with them made them also realize that lawyers not always want to regulate and stifle everything, but actually want to give like guidance and say, okay, maybe that's a better approach in order to do something that's valuable. So I think like a dialogue is important, and having actual spaces where you can collaborate. So at the Alan Turing Institute, we have that, for example. We have it also at the Oxford Internet Institute, where we have like people from multiple disciplines working together. And I would like to see more of those institutions in the future.
Perfect, thanks. And just since you specifically mentioned Vienna, we're also trying to make the Vienna legal scene a little bit more privacy friendly, in that I work at the University of Economics and Business in Vienna, and we have a privacy and sustainable computing lab, which is trying to create exactly those spaces that you missed when you were studying there a while ago. So hopefully we're working on that at least. Polina, the floor is yours.
Yes, I just I have nothing else to add, except that I agree, of course, with my previous speakers, and that we need more dialogue and communication between different disciplines, and that we're so focused on our specific areas and sort of sometimes forget about others that actually work for the same thing, for the same cause, just on a slightly different perspective. And I think we should just all unite and just communicate and talk to each other.
Sounds amazing. Mirco.
Yeah, nothing to add, except for that what's actually happening here is what could make it possible to dumb it down a bit. And the experience I take with home is maybe the exact point where maybe I should or I might quit my job because I'm not able to reduce the complexity of these the issue appropriately. But no, yeah. I think it's important to keep an open line of communication between all the disciplines and make all the findings and the arguments available, and that's where open education comes in. We haven't talked about that, and make it available for the society and to build upon that.
Sounds amazing. Daniel, you have 30 seconds for your final remarks. Go.
Okay. I'm very happy that we had this nice discussion, and we could see in which way source code actually can help to achieve transparency. And we also saw that there are many problems with the data and the selection of data. So there we have a lot of work to do, and also for translation and literacy and translation. I just want to end that not only the users need a translation of knowledge, but also the experts have to learn to translate their knowledge to each other. So thank you for this brilliant panel, for the brilliant engagement with the involvement of you in the audience. And
thank you very much for coming, and please join me in thanking the wonderful experts.